"You don't deserve any discount." The words cut through the busy store like a blade. Everyone in line turned to stare. The old man stood there, quiet, holding his receipt with shaking hands while the young cashier rolled her eyes and tapped her perfectly manicured nails against the counter. "Sir, I told you already. The military discount is for real veterans. You look too old to have served anywhere that matters." He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, just stood there in his faded jacket, one hand gripping the counter for support, the other clutching a small pin on his chest that nobody had bothered to look at closely. Behind him, customers whispered. Some pulled out phones. Others shook their heads in disgust. But not at her. At him. The old man who was apparently trying to scam his way to saving $15 on groceries. What none of them knew, what the cashier couldn't see from her position of assumed authority, was that the small pin the man was protecting had cost him more than any of them could imagine. And the manager walking toward the commotion was about to recognize something that would change everything. Welcome to the silent ranks. Before we dive into this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of our community. The morning had started like any other at Riverside Grocery, a mid-sized supermarket in a quiet suburb where most people knew each other by sight, if not by name. The store opened at 7, and by 8:30, the usual rush of commuters grabbing coffee and retirees doing their weekly shopping had begun to fill the aisles. Harold Mitchell had been coming to this store for 12 years, ever since he'd moved to the neighborhood after his wife passed. He was 73, walked with a slight limp that got worse in cold weather, and had a routine that rarely varied. Tuesday mornings at 8:45, he'd arrive with his carefully written list, shop methodically through each aisle, and check out at Register 3 because it was closest to the door. The employees knew him by sight. Some of the older cashiers would ask about his garden or comment on the weather. He never said much in return, just nodded politely and went about his business. He wasn't unfriendly, exactly, but he carried himself like a man who had learned to keep his own counsel. That Tuesday, Harold moved slowly through the store, his basket gradually filling with the simple provisions of a man who cooked for one. Bread, milk, eggs, a small package of ground beef, canned soup, bananas that weren't quite ripe. Nothing expensive, nothing fancy, just the basics to get him through another week. The limp was particularly bad that morning. The physical therapy he'd been doing for his left leg wasn't helping much anymore, and the doctors had started using words like deterioration and progressive damage that made him feel older than his years. Still, he persevered, moving at his own pace, taking his time to read labels and compare prices like a man who understood the value of every dollar. At the pharmacy counter, he picked up his prescriptions, blood pressure medication, something for the arthritis in his hands, and pain pills he rarely took because they made him feel disconnected from the world. The pharmacist, a kind woman named Linda who had been filling his prescriptions for years, smiled and asked how he was feeling. "Getting by," he said, which was his standard response to most questions about his well-being. She handed him the bag and noticed him favoring his left side more than usual. "That leg giving you trouble today, Mr. Mitchell?" He nodded once. "Weather's changing. Well, you take care of yourself. And don't be too proud to use that cane if you need it." Harold had a cane at home, a simple wooden one his late wife had bought him years ago when he'd first started having problems. He hated using it, hated what it represented, hated the way people looked at him differently when he walked with assistance. But some days, like today, pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. By the time he made it to the checkout line, his basket was full and his leg was throbbing. Register 3 was busy, so he got in line behind a young mother with 2 small children and a cart full of groceries. The wait didn't bother him. He used the time to organize his coupons and count out his money, making sure he had enough cash to cover everything. The cashier at Register 3 was new, someone Harold hadn't seen before. She looked to be in her early 20s, with bright pink highlights in her dark hair and nails painted in alternating colors. Her name tag read Brittany, and she worked with the efficiency of someone who wanted to get through each transaction as quickly as possible. Harold watched her interact with the customers ahead of him. She wasn't rude, exactly, but she wasn't particularly friendly either. She scanned items rapidly, barely making eye contact, occasionally sighing when someone took too long to pay or needed price checks on items. When it was finally his turn, Harold placed his basket on the counter and began unloading his groceries slowly, his arthritic hands making the process more deliberate than it once had been. Brittany tapped her foot impatiently, already reaching for items before he had finished setting them down. "Good morning," Harold said quietly, more out of habit than expectation of a response. Brittany didn't look up from the register screen. She scanned his items in rapid succession, the beeping of the scanner creating a steady rhythm that filled the silence between them. Bread, milk, eggs, soup, bananas. Each item registered with mechanical precision. When she finished scanning, she looked at the total and announced, $37.46. Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, a worn leather billfold that had seen better days. As he opened it to count out his money, he said quietly, "I'd like to use the military discount, please." Brittany looked up for the first time, her eyes taking in Harold's appearance with obvious skepticism. She saw an old man in a faded denim jacket, gray hair that needed cutting, weathered hands that shook slightly as he counted bills. To her, he looked like every other elderly person trying to find ways to save money on groceries. "Do you have your military ID?" she asked, her tone already suggesting she expected the answer to be no. Harold's hand moved instinctively to his chest, where a small pin was attached to his jacket. "I have this," he said quietly, indicating the medal. Brittany glanced at it dismissively. It was small, purple and gold, old-looking. To her inexperienced eye, it could have been anything. A fraternal organization pin, a company service award, something bought at a flea market for a few dollars. "That's not an ID," she said flatly. "I need to see official military identification." "I don't carry it anymore," Harold replied, his voice still calm, but with an edge of resignation. "But this is a Purple Heart. I was wounded in Vietnam." The words hung in the air between them. Behind Harold, the line was starting to grow longer. A few customers shifted impatiently, checking their phones or looking at their watches. Someone coughed. A child in a shopping cart whined for candy. Brittany's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked more annoyed. "Look, sir, I don't know what that thing is, but I can't give you a military discount without proper ID. That's the policy." Harold's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had faced this kind of skepticism before, though rarely so directly. People his age were often questioned about their service, as if being a veteran was somehow incompatible with being elderly, as if the wars they had fought were so distant that their participation in them had become mythical. "I understand you have policies," he said carefully, "but I'm telling you that I am a veteran, and I was wounded in service to my country." The conversation was beginning to draw attention. Other customers were listening now, some straining to hear what was happening, others pretending not to notice while clearly tuning in to every word. Brittany rolled her eyes, a gesture that was both visible and deliberately dismissive. "Sir, with all due respect, you look way too old to have been in any recent military action. And I can't just take your word for it because you have some old pin." The words hit Harold like a physical blow. Too old. As if his age somehow diminished his service. As if the passage of time had erased what he had endured. He stood there, holding his money, feeling the eyes of everyone in line boring into his back. "Vietnam," he repeated quietly. "I served in Vietnam." "That was like 50 years ago," Brittany said, her voice rising slightly with impatience. "Even if you did serve then, which I'm not saying you did, you'd have to have actual proof. I can't just give discounts to every old guy who claims he was in some war." The silence that followed was deafening. Harold felt something cold settle in his chest, a familiar feeling he had hoped never to experience again. It was the same sensation he had felt decades ago when protesters at airports had called him and his fellow soldiers baby killers, when neighbors had turned away from them on the street, when the country they had served had treated them like pariahs instead of veterans. Behind him, someone cleared their throat loudly. "Could you just pay so the rest of us can get through?" A woman's voice called out. Another voice joined in. "Some people will try anything to save a few bucks." Harold's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his wallet again. He could feel the Purple Heart on his chest, the small piece of metal that represented the worst day of his life and somehow, simultaneously, proof of his service to a country that had never quite known what to do with him. The shaking in his hands got worse as he tried to count out the full amount. $37.46. Plus tax. He had enough, but just barely. and using the military discount would have meant having enough left over for the prescription copay he still needed to make at another pharmacy across town. Brittany watched him struggle with his money, her impatience growing more obvious by the second. She drummed her fingers on the counter, sighed loudly, and made a show of looking at the growing line behind him. "Sir, I need you to hurry up," she said. "You're holding up other customers." Harold's fingers fumbled with the bills. His arthritis was acting up, making it difficult to separate the 20s from the 10s. A 20 fell to the floor, and as he bent slowly to pick it up, his knee nearly gave out. He caught himself against the counter, breathing hard from the effort. "This is ridiculous," someone behind him muttered. Brittany watched him struggle and shook her head. "Look, do you have the money or not? Because if you can't afford your groceries, maybe you shouldn't be shopping here." The words were like salt in an open wound. Harold straightened slowly, his face flushed with a combination of exertion and humiliation. Around him, he could feel the judgment of strangers, the assumption that he was just another elderly person struggling to get by, trying to work the system for a few dollars. "I can afford my groceries," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Then pay for them," Brittany shot back. "At full price, without the fake military discount." It was at that moment that Harold made a decision. He could have paid. He could have counted out his money, completed the transaction, and walked away. He could have absorbed this humiliation the way he had absorbed so many others over the years. But something inside him, something that had been quiet for too long, refused to accept it. He straightened his shoulders, looked directly into Brittany's eyes, and said in a voice that carried clearly through the store, "Young lady, I did not spend 13 months in the jungles of Vietnam. I did not watch my friends die. And I did not take shrapnel in my leg and back just so I could stand in this store 50 years later and be told by someone who wasn't even born when I was bleeding for this country that I don't deserve a $15 discount on groceries." The store went dead silent. Every conversation stopped. Every customer turned to look. Even the soft music playing over the speakers seemed to pause in respect for the gravity of what had just been said. Brittany, for the first time since the interaction began, looked uncertain. She had expected the old man to back down, to pay his money and shuffle away embarrassed. Instead, he was standing straighter, speaking with a clarity and force that commanded attention. "I don't know what your problem is," she said, but her voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. "But I still can't give you a discount without proper ID." "Then don't," Harold replied. "But don't you dare tell me I don't deserve it. Don't you dare question my service or suggest that I'm lying about what I went through for this country." The confrontation might have continued escalating, might have devolved into something uglier, but at that moment, a voice from across the store called out, "What's going on over here?" Everyone turned to see a man in his 50s walking quickly toward Register 3. He wore a polo shirt with the store's logo and a name tag that identified him as Mike, store manager. His expression was serious, the look of someone who had heard raised voices and was coming to investigate. Mike Reynolds had been managing grocery stores for over 20 years. He had seen every kind of customer dispute imaginable, from price checks gone wrong to accusations of theft to disagreements over expired coupons. He prided himself on his ability to defuse situations quickly and professionally, keeping both customers and employees happy whenever possible. But as he approached Register 3, he could sense that this was different. The tension in the air was palpable, and the crowd of customers watching was larger than usual. More concerning was the expression on Harold Mitchell's face. Mike had seen Harold in the store countless times over the years, and he had never seen the quiet old man look angry. "Brittany, what's the situation here?" Mike asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Brittany looked relieved to see her manager. "This guy is trying to use a military discount, but he doesn't have any ID. He's got some old pin he claims makes him a veteran, but I told him I need proper identification. Now he's getting all upset about it." Mike nodded, taking in the information. He looked at Harold, who was standing rigidly at the counter, his hands still shaking slightly, but his expression determined. "Sir, I apologize for any confusion," Mike said diplomatically. "Could you help me understand what's happening?" Harold looked at the manager, trying to decide whether this man would be any different from his employee. After a moment, he spoke, his voice quieter now, but still carrying the weight of accumulated frustration. "I asked for the military discount. I told her I'm a veteran, showed her my Purple Heart. She told me I look too old to have served anywhere that matters, that she can't give discounts to every old guy who claims he was in some war. Mike's expression shifted slightly. Those weren't the words he would have expected from Brittany, and they certainly weren't in line with the store's customer service standards. More importantly, something about the way Harold said "Purple Heart" made him look more closely at the pin on the old man's jacket. What Mike saw made his breath catch. It was small, no bigger than a silver dollar, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. The purple ribbon with white edges, the gold profile of George Washington, the simple inscription, "For military merit." Mike's own father had earned one in Korea, and Mike had grown up seeing it displayed in a place of honor in their living room. This wasn't some fraternal organization pin or company service award. This was the Purple Heart, America's oldest military decoration, awarded only to those wounded or killed in service to their country. And the one pinned to Harold Mitchell's jacket looked genuine, aged, and well-worn from years of wear. Mike felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not only had his employee treated a customer rudely, she had dismissed and insulted a wounded veteran. The implications of this were staggering, both for the store's reputation and, more importantly, for the man standing in front of him who had endured treatment that no veteran should ever have to face. "Mr. Mitchell," Mike said quietly, his voice carrying a respect that hadn't been there moments before. "Is that a Purple Heart?" Harold's hand moved instinctively to the metal, a gesture that was both protective and proud. "Yes, it is." Mike stepped closer, not to invade Harold's space, but to get a better look at the decoration. As he examined it, he could see the details that marked it as authentic. The craftsmanship, the wear patterns, the way it had been carefully maintained over decades. This wasn't a replica or a fake. This was the real thing, earned through blood and sacrifice. "May I ask when and where you served?" Mike asked, his tone completely different from the skeptical questions Harold had been facing. "Vietnam," Harold replied. 68 to 69. 1st Infantry Division. Mike nodded slowly. The 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, had seen some of the heaviest fighting in Vietnam. If Harold had served with them during 1968 to 69, he would have been in the thick of some of the war's most brutal engagements. "And your Purple Heart?" Mike asked gently. Harold was quiet for a moment, as if deciding whether to share something he rarely talked about. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but everyone in the area was listening intently. "Firebase Charlie. Mortar attack. March 15, 1969. Lost 3 good friends that day. Took shrapnel in my left leg and back." He paused, swallowing hard. "Still got pieces in there the doctors couldn't get out." The silence that followed was profound. Mike felt ashamed, not just for his employees' behavior, but for every moment of doubt that had preceded this revelation. Here was a man who had bled for his country, who carried pieces of war in his body 50 years later, and he had been treated like a fraud trying to steal $15. Brittany, meanwhile, was beginning to understand the magnitude of her mistake. She had heard of the Purple Heart, vaguely knew it was important, but had never seen one or understood what it represented. The old man's quiet words about friends lost and shrapnel still in his body painted a picture that made her previous dismissiveness seem cruel beyond measure. Mike turned to address the customers who had gathered to watch the confrontation. His voice carried clearly through the store, ensuring that everyone who had witnessed Harold's humiliation would also witness what came next. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said formally, "I want you all to know that the man standing here is Mr. Harold Mitchell, a Purple Heart recipient who served our country with honor in Vietnam. He was wounded in service to all of us, and he deserves not just our gratitude but our respect." Then Mike did something that surprised everyone, including Harold. He stepped back, stood at attention, and rendered a crisp salute to the veteran. The effect was immediate and powerful. Several customers began applauding. Others stood straighter, as if suddenly aware they were in the presence of someone who had sacrificed for their freedom. A few had tears in their eyes. Harold, caught off guard by the sudden show of respect, didn't know how to respond at first. It had been decades since anyone had saluted him, decades since his service had been acknowledged in such a public way. Slowly, instinctively, he returned the salute, his back straightening, his trembling hands finding their old steadiness. When the moment ended, Mike turned to Brittany. His expression was serious, his voice carrying the weight of both disappointment and authority. "Brittany, I need to see you in my office immediately after we resolve this situation. What happened here today is completely unacceptable and does not represent the values of this store or how we treat our customers, especially our veterans." Brittany's face had gone pale. She was beginning to realize that her dismissive treatment of Harold wasn't just rude customer service. It was a serious incident that could have consequences for her employment. "Mr. Mitchell," Mike continued, turning back to Harold. "First, I want to apologize on behalf of this store for the treatment you received today. It was wrong, it was disrespectful, and it will not happen again." Harold nodded slightly, accepting the apology but still processing everything that had happened. "Second," Mike continued, "not only will we honor your military discount today, but I want you to know that you will always be welcome in this store, and your service will always be respected here." Mike personally handled the transaction, applying not just the standard military discount, but reducing Harold's total even further. When Harold tried to protest, Mike shook his head. "Sir, with respect, this is the least we can do. And I hope you'll continue shopping here, because we're honored to serve customers like you." As Harold gathered his groceries, several customers approached him. An elderly woman thanked him for his service. A middle-aged man shook his hand. A young mother with her children used the moment to teach her kids about respect for veterans. Harold accepted their gratitude quietly, still somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden change in how he was being treated. For years, his service had been invisible, forgotten, dismissed as ancient history. Now, suddenly, people were seeing him not as just another old man, but as someone who had served and sacrificed. As he walked toward the exit, Mike accompanied him, continuing to apologize and ensuring Harold knew he was valued as a customer. At the door, Mike paused and asked a question that had been bothering him. "Mr. Mitchell, if you don't mind me asking, why don't you carry your military ID anymore?" Harold was quiet for a moment, then replied with characteristic understatement, "Got tired of having to prove what I'd already proven." The words carried a weight that Mike fully understood. How many times had Harold been questioned about his service? How many times had he been forced to justify his sacrifices to skeptical strangers? How exhausting must it be to carry proof of your service because people assumed you were lying about it? "Well, sir," Mike said firmly, "you'll never have to prove anything in this store again. Your word and that Purple Heart are more than enough for us." Harold nodded his thanks and walked slowly to his car, his limp perhaps a little less pronounced, his shoulders a little straighter. Behind him, through the store windows, he could see customers still talking about what had happened, Brittany being escorted to the manager's office, and Mike instructing other employees about proper treatment of veterans. As Harold drove home, he found himself thinking about the morning's events. The humiliation had been real and painful, a reminder of how quickly respect could be withdrawn from those who had earned it through service. But the resolution had been equally powerful, a demonstration that there were still people who understood the value of what veterans had sacrificed. That evening, Harold did something he rarely did. He called his neighbor, Frank, another Vietnam veteran he occasionally talked to but had never gotten close to. They had both learned to keep their service private, to avoid the questions and assumptions that came with being veterans of an unpopular war. "Frank," Harold said when his neighbor answered, "you ever been treated like you were lying about your service?" There was a pause, then a bitter laugh. "More times than I can count." "What?" Harold told him about the morning at the grocery store, about Brittany's dismissiveness and Mike's eventual intervention. As he talked, he realized this was the first time in years he had shared details about his service with anyone. "Sounds like you met one of the good ones," Frank said, referring to Mike. "Most people don't know what to look for, don't understand what we went through." "Made me think," Harold said. "Maybe we've been too quiet about it. Maybe staying invisible hasn't served us well." The conversation continued for another hour, two old soldiers finally talking about experiences they had kept private for decades. They talked about coming home to protests instead of parades, about learning to hide their service rather than display it, about watching younger veterans from more recent wars receive the recognition that had been denied to them. By the time Harold hung up, he had made a decision. The next Tuesday, when he returned to Riverside Grocery for his weekly shopping, he would wear his Purple Heart again. Not defiantly, not demanding attention, but as a quiet acknowledgement of his service and a reminder to himself and others that some things shouldn't be hidden. The following week, Harold's return to the store created a small stir. Mike was there to greet him personally, and several employees nodded respectfully as he passed. Brittany was nowhere to be seen. Harold later learned she had been transferred to a different department after completing additional training on customer service and cultural sensitivity. Word of the previous week's incident had spread through the community. A local newspaper had picked up the story, and Harold found himself briefly famous as an example of how veterans were sometimes treated and how they deserved to be treated. He didn't enjoy the attention, but he understood its importance. More significantly, other veterans began showing themselves. Frank started wearing his own medals when he went out. Another neighbor, a Korean War veteran named Bill, began talking openly about his service for the first time in decades. The incident had created a small but meaningful shift in how these men saw themselves and their place in the community. Harold continued shopping at Riverside Grocery every Tuesday morning. Mike always made a point of greeting him, and other customers often nodded respectfully when they saw the Purple Heart on his jacket. The simple pin had become a bridge between Harold's private past and his public present, a way of honoring his service without demanding attention for it. Sometimes the simplest acts of recognition matter the most. Not the grand gestures or the public ceremonies, but the quiet moments when someone sees you for who you really are and treats you accordingly. Harold Mitchell had served his country with honor, had been wounded in its service, and had carried the invisible scars of that service for 50 years. For one morning in a grocery store, those sacrifices had been dismissed and diminished by someone who didn't understand their significance. But in the end, respect had prevailed. Truth had emerged, and a veteran who had learned to hide his service had found reasons to display it proudly once again. The Purple Heart on Harold's jacket wasn't just a decoration. It was proof of service, evidence of sacrifice, and a reminder that freedom isn't free. It represented blood spilled on foreign soil, friends lost in distant wars, and a young man's willingness to answer his country's call even when that country didn't always appreciate the answer. Most importantly, it represented the simple truth that some debts can never be fully repaid, but they should always be acknowledged. Harold Mitchell had paid a price for his service that would last the rest of his life. The least a grateful nation could do was recognize that sacrifice and treat him with the respect he had earned. In the end, that's all any veteran asks for. Not special treatment, not constant praise, but simple recognition of what they gave and what they lost in service to something larger than themselves. Harold Mitchell got that recognition, finally, after 50 years of waiting. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. It's never too late to say thank you to those who served, and it's never acceptable to question the sacrifices they made for all of us. This story was brought to you by the Silent Ranks. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who served quietly, sacrificed silently, or gave of themselves without expecting anything in return? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their example shaped your understanding of true service. And if you think stories like Harold's need to be heard, if you believe we should never forget the sacrifices made by those who served, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Every subscription helps us continue sharing these important human stories that remind us of the best in people and the values worth preserving. We'll see you in the next one.